Good morning, Year 6. It's Thursday, the 3rd of February, and it's Mrs. Ullah here. Our learning objective today is to understand how authors develop characters and settings. So last week we looked at the first 4 pictures, and the animals and land had been created, but then the animals started to make too much noise, and the gods needed somebody to look after them. Okay, so we're going to continue with the story today. So it says, the first race of men were made from wet clay. The creators gave them life, and the first men tried to speak, but instead they crumbled apart soon after they were made. The Maker and the feathered spirit were determined to create a hardier race of men. The second race of men were carved from wood. These were much stronger, and were able to walk and talk and multiply. But these men had no minds, and their hearts were empty. They had no memory of their creation, and when they spoke, their words were just as empty and meaningless. They could not praise their God. Tepu and Gukmaz sent a great flood down to destroy them. They commanded the animals to attack the survivors and tear them to pieces. The few who managed to escape fled to the woods and became monkeys. The creators left them there as an example to the next race of men. The Maker and the feathered spirit thought for a long time about how they could make a race of men they wanted. There seemed to be no perfect material to build them. Finally, some animals brought the gods a stack of white corn, which grew on the far side of the earth. Tepu and Gukmaz ground this into a paste, and from this formed 4 individual men. The new beings seemed perfect. They were sturdy enough to last, and their minds were rich with thoughts and feelings. Their first act, after their own creation, was to immediately worship Tepu and Gukmaz and thank them for their lives. And that's where we're going to stop our story. Okay, so it did go a little bit further, where it starts talking about what they can see and how they're not quite perfect. But we're going to stop our story at the point where they just thank them for their lives. So last week we basically just retold the start of the story. Okay, going to do similar this week. However, there's going to be a bit of a twist to it. So instead of you making some men from clay, some men from wood, and then from the corn, we're going to have a twist, and you're going to decide what would you make the men from. Okay, so you need to pick 3 different materials that the men could be made from, and I'd like you to just jot those down so you don't forget. Have a real think about it. Don't just think about the first ones that come to mind. Have a think, what could you make them from? Think about the first 2 didn't work, and then the third one did. Okay, so think about that when thinking about your own. So I want you to think about this question. When we're writing descriptions of characters and settings, why is it so important to carefully consider the vocabulary that is being used? So we've spoken a lot about this in reading and in writing, and we often talk about a person being able to visualize. Okay, so when somebody is reading something, they need to be able to visualize it. And we've talked about how important that is. We've done it ourselves. We've drawn pictures when we've been reading and things like that. So you need to really keep that in mind when you are writing, okay? Remember, we are writing for the reader. We're not writing for ourselves. So if we're writing for a reader, we need that reader to be able to take what we have written and put it in their own mind and visualize. They should be able to see, maybe not exactly what we see, but a version of it. Okay, so you need to think about your descriptions. Are you describing a character or a setting in a way that somebody else would be able to visualize what you are wanting them to visualize? And that's really, really important. So keeping in mind what I've just said, have a look at these 2 sentences. The first one says the men were made of clay. Okay. Do I know what the clay looked like? Was it dry clay? Was it wet clay? The clay being painted? I don't know. I don't know much about them at all. I don't know, was it made just from a lump of clay? Did they have arms? Did they have legs? I don't know anything from that. Okay? In my mind, I might be visualizing something completely different to you. Okay? You might be visualizing something completely different to your friend. Have a look at the next sentence. The men were made of wet clay. They had been pressed together carefully to mould the shape of a human body, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. Now, can you visualize what those men looked like? If you look back at slide 3, I think it is, does that description fit with those people? Okay, and just think really carefully about that. Okay, we need to help that reader to visualize what you're trying to get across. So your task today, you need to take those 3 different materials that your people are going to be made from that we've done in the previous slide. You should have jotted those down. And I want you to make a brainstorm of vocabulary to describe each one. Think about the questions below, this will help you. So what do the people look like? I do not just want a quick description. I want you to come up with as much vocabulary as you possibly can to describe those people. How are you going to make that reader visualize that person? Okay? You need to be thinking about using thesaurus or using Google to find synonyms, words that mean the same. Okay? I want to see some really good vocabulary on that list. Then I want you to think about, how do they move? So if they're made from wood, they're going to move very differently to the ones that were made of corn. So think about the material that you've used. How are they going to move? Think about using verbs and adverbs to describe it. So then I've popped underneath, like I've just said, what adjectives can we use? What verbs and adverbs can we use? Can you use some expanded noun phrases? Can you think of a simile? Can't speak today. A simile to compare them. Okay, can you compare them to something else? Could you use a metaphor? Okay, a couple of weeks ago we were looking at metaphors and you're coming up with some brilliant ones, so could you think back and use a metaphor? Then under each one, you need to note down, how did the gods get rid of the men? Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, I've done you a little bit of an example. So here's an example of how you could set out your work. So you'll have 3 separate ones of these. So when you submit your work, I should be seeing 3 different brainstorms. So I've just used the example of the clay men. So I've got my clay men in the middle. I've then got 2 branches coming off. One that describes what they look like, one that describes how they move. Then from the blue lines, I would be thinking of vocabulary to describe each one. So from the appearance, I'd be thinking of adjectives. I would also be thinking of expanded noun phrases. On the movement, I'd be thinking of verbs and adverbs to describe how they move. Okay, so I'd like to see a lot of vocabulary on there to describe them. Then at the bottom, I want you to explain how the god got rid of them. Okay, so for example, if I were doing the story that we've just read, I would do 1 for the clay men, 1 for the wood men, and 1 for the men made of corn. Okay, so when you submit it, you should be submitting 3 different brainstorms. Okay, so I look forward to having a look at those year 6, and I will speak to you soon.